Thanks, Miranda, for this introduction. I should go to the microphone, okay? Well, that helps always. What I present here are some, in the first part of the presentation, conceptual ideas around resilience and sustainability. And then I go more to the reflections of a council, which is always, of course, actions of a council. Because we kind of think and do think, and thinking without doing is not our business. I found a quote here, and I quote, "Nature is very resilient if we just stop actively destroying it." I think this is nicely put by President Obama recently, September. Nature is very resilient if we just stop actively destroying it. 8 times the term resilient pops up in the language of the Sustainable Development Goals of the Agenda 2030. But more or less in the sense of an addition to something. So like resilient transport system or resilient energy services, something like this. Not in the sense Obama used it. For us as a council, the term resilient is a given because there is no sustainable development without being resilient in the sense Carl pointed out, resilient to unforeseeable and unpreventable disasters in terms of emergency responses, that kind of things. But with the kind of official definition, and you in the first presentation already pointed us to this, the official definition for and I take it Wikipedia-wise as some kind of official definition, resilience is seen as the ability of a system to cope with change, and that's nonsense. If we want the system to change into the direction of decarbonization, we don't want the system to bounce back in the previous state. If we are trying to phase out nuclear energy in Germany, we don't want the nuclear community to bounce simply back into what we had before. The point is that sustainable development has a direction. It has goals, indicators. It has democratic agreements, arrangements, institutional arrangements. And within this frame, resilience makes sense, but only seen as coping of a system and bouncing back towards the previous state, that's nonsense. And I would drive Carl's argument on the economy a little bit further. It's not the crisis that strikes a system. The crisis in the economy lies in the system. So there is no way to simply bounce back. But when we thought on the council about resilience, I found out a story that I want to share with you. It is most important, I think. And for this, I would tell you about a person called Aaron Antonovsky. He was born in the United States in 1923, and he emigrated to Israel in 1960. I held a couple of positions in the Israeli Institute for Applied Social Research and the Medical Sociology. And Antonovsky dedicated his academic work to investigate the differences, the social class differences, when it comes to mortality and morbidity. And he chose to look into the fate of Holocaust survivors, of those people living in Israel that survived the Holocaust. And what he found out was that 29% of the women who survived in Nazi concentration camps had a positive emotional health. That's surprising, because normally you would say they're all traumatized. And even a third of those survivors having a positive emotional health. That means that those group of people was not emotionally impaired by the physical and psychological terror and stress and death. And this is a finding that prompted Antonovsky to ask a couple of questions. Why do some people stay healthy and others do not? Others getting killed or traumatized? Regardless of the severe hardships and the adversities that they all had to experience collectively. Why is this different? And in a sense a little bit deeper, what is the origin of health? What creates health? And why are people staying healthy? While in the same group others stay not. He then developed a theory of health and illness and of coping and resilience. He termed this theory salutogenesis, the way to stay healthy, as opposite to pathogenesis. That's what the medical system is caring about. So curing, emergency response, first help, therapies. Salutogenesis is about producing health and about precaution. Why is this so important for us? It tells us the story that it's not the system that we should look at. It's the difference in between the system that is the most interesting part. Not the system as a complex entity, as whatever, resilient or bouncing back, but it's people's reaction that can be very different. And we should get a clear understanding why people react differently. And that is, you can turn it in practical terms, and very much, so to say, the inner sense of what we as a council are doing. We are looking very much into the system and pointing and finding the rift in between the system, like the economy. You're going to have to ask, to what extent a green economy, green enterprises, I'm doing something differently from the rest of the pack. And if you look at the right-wing populism that is striking all our countries, again, it's important to understand the rift in between this group of people. And we have to ask what makes ourselves resilient to these kinds of overarching developments in our personal reaction. I mean, we don't have to suffer concentration camps, but in some way we are all suffering from adversities in our personal life. What makes us resilient? So this is the story of Aaron Antonovsky that reflects a certain way to approach resilience, not in the terms of a earth science, but in the terms of a policy style. And speaking of policy styles, I want to show you a picture. That's Europe. We have in Germany a tabloid. It's not as bad as the Sun. But it's as bad as you can come to it when you're in Germany. But still, amazingly, the Bild-Zeitung, that's it called, this tabloid, this week they came up with a European edition. All of a sudden. This is the picture of Europe they are painting. And you find your country, your specimen on this picture. Everybody. Normally and regularly, you would expect a tabloid and the Bild-Zeitung to bash Europe and to tell some crazy stories about European bureaucrats. This time, they don't. They did not. They painted a positive picture. And they asked people from all of our countries, 28 countries, still 28, what is their attitude towards Europe? What they benefit from? Neither of them told a story about sustainable development or about whatever strategies or resilience. There was very basically day-to-day experience. But still, it's a positive sign they gave. And this is, I think, what happens when you look outside the box, outside our policy debates. And it is how I am trying to connect with these movements and attitudes in society. And in a bigger, in a policy circle understanding, we now have to relate the Agenda 2030, SDGs, to the national level. And I think we can all agree that politics, the national level, is not fit for purpose as it stands now. And Miranda, I would add, science is neither fit for purpose. I mean, only this story about the Scientific Advisory Board to the UN Secretary General. They advocated having a particular and special and standalone SDG for science. This never materialized, fortunately. There is a case for science for sustainability, of course. And you see pretty much all of these SDGs as in some way coupled with evidence, with scientific research, with whatever have you, including the earth science. But you prove the case of scientists thinking and moving in their science box when you claim, and you make the claim for a SDG for science. And politicians at that stage say, no, thanks, we don't want to have you in a kind of a zoo, a science zoo, and restricted and separated from everything else. The national level here is important, because you asked in the question for this presentation on the EU level here, SDGs, as in the case of the Paris Agreement, in the national determined contributions, they are both now asking the national level to implement in internationally agreed goals and agreement. This gives the national level a new position. We never had this before. It also asks, what is this supranational, the multilateral system? And the UN system, at least the UN development system, 34 agencies are struggling hard with this picture. They see themselves out of the policy cycle now. They are not out of the policy cycle, but they have to reposition themselves. And I think the same is true for the European community and for our European institutions. When it comes to the implementation of the SDGs. That's why I think Europe needs a new linking, and if I repeat back before my eyes our history here in the room. We started out at the EEAC as an Environmental Councils network, then we added the National SD Councils in 2002, I think, or 3. We started from the debates in Kinsale. Maybe some of you remember the Irish Kinsale. We had this wonderful paper on the EU. We had these debates in Warsaw. We had in Dubrovnik. We had a couple of times when we discussed and found collective ground on approaching the EU level for the purpose of sustainable development. There used to be something called the Gothenburg Strategy. Maybe some of you remember this. We are, as a council, we are strongly advocating having a EU SD strategy against all odds and against what today, excluding Karl, is the general thinking on the level of the Commission. And that is why I think we all have the right to say that we're deeply unsatisfied with the state of how Europe acts towards sustainable development, and that is not a resilient position the European Commission now takes. But also this councils, and I'm only talking about the German one in that minute, we need to rearrange our politics. We are national councils, but we are now acting in a policy field that connects national and multilateral goals in a new way. How would we react? How resilient is our work towards this new challenge of the Agenda 2030? And we are in the middle of thinking about this. One of our efforts is to go European as a national council. And that is why we back up the European Sustainable Development Week as this is a grassroots event. And this is part of my presentation where I do some advertising for this. You're all invited to join this collective effort. We have now, in the last year, we had more than 4,000 individual actions devoted to sustainable development, all by grassroots, by initiatives, by small enterprises, not doctored by the government. It just bottom up. This builds resilience in the sense of resilience from the people. We will have this in beginning of May next year again, and well, yes, the council, the French friends, and the Austrian, we are kind of putting money together to make this work, and you're all invited to present your country's initiatives there. The German Council, when it comes to resilience and sustainable development in the private sector, we are challenging the private sector. Lots of stories to be told here, but I will refrain only to the case of the sustainability code. That's a simple reporting tool. It allows a company to report on their sustainable development performance in a transparent way. Fortunately, the Commission took the decision in, last year, to come up with what they call a directive on corporate social responsibility, forcing member states to implement this directive nationally by next year, coming into force next year. And this directive asks companies with more than 500 employees to legally report back on their non-financial performance, meaning ecologic and social standards, human trafficking, corruption, the supply chain, human rights in the supply chain, the ecology, the resource management, and that kind of things. This has to be reported, and they are legally bound to do so. The Sustainability Code is a tool to report, and we are doing this not only for Germany. We have opened our agenda. We have it translated into a couple of languages, and we have 5 entry points devoted to other, in the data bank, 5 entry points devoted to other countries' contributions, or enterprises from other countries. So this is, again, something that is new, a new kid on the block. And it is not nationally anymore, it's European. But we're not waiting for the European Commission to do so. I mean, this would be a job for the Commission as well. But as the Commission is not doing the job, we are doing it. We are addressing Parliament. This is the one and most important point when you go for a resilient policy. You have to bring it to the knowledge of our democratic partners in Parliament. Democracy is important because their decisions are taken. And we had here you see the German parliamentarians that are members of a body dealing with sustainable development, and they're quite active in this field. And I would like to make this point that we have to connect these kind of parliamentarian activities throughout Europe, including the European Parliament. Now, mainstreaming, and again, science, Miranda. As you rightly pointed out, a Sustainable Development Council is not a scientific body. It's a multi-stakeholder body. But we are strongly relying on evidence from science, of course. We are issuing a couple of studies and so. And a couple of years ago, I initiated a competition in Germany addressing the private sector and the local communities. So what is your performance towards sustainable development? And we have a scientific system, some researchers, the Wuppertal Institute, ICLEI, A.T. Kearney, universities, they all dive deep into the data that we collect in order to avoid greenwashing and that kind of things. And on the basis of this hardcore data management and this hardcore checking what is true, what is only kind of advertising, we come up with the jury decision. I'm heading these juries on private sector and the enterprises and research and so on. And we then have a couple of winners. And now the important point is, what do you do with a winner in terms of sustainable development? And what do you do with those people who have not won? Well, losers in that sense. And my answer is try to work on a culture of sustainable development that is inclusive. And it leads to the situation Aaron Antonovsky described. You personally can bounce back. You have to be encouraged, motivated, in a good sense. Hope has to be in the room. And at that moment, I want to show you a movie picture on the celebration event we had for those people in Germany who are doing the hardcore stuff when it comes to sustainable development, turning companies around, adding the sustainable business case, standing in front of their electorate in the city and telling them the story of sustainable development as Lord Mayor. And in this event, we include celebrities.